Hello and welcome. We are so glad to have you all with us. My name is Dahlia Habib Linson, and I'm delighted to have you all join us for our Museum Careers Today panel, where we're going to be exploring a whole range of professions within conservation in art museums. I'm really delighted to be joined by a host of wonderful colleagues, and it's now my privilege to turn it over to Randall G. So could we have the next slide, please?
Although I am not physically there now, we would like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, founded in 1870, stands on the historic homelands of the Massachusetts people, a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different nations. The museum acknowledges the long history of the land it occupies today and seeks ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in its galleries and programming. We can all learn more about the Massachusetts people who continue to be one of many Indigenous stewards of this land by visiting massachusettstribe.org. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Randall. Randall's joining us from Northeastern University as a co-op student. As this slide indicates, we are recording this session, and the recording may be uploaded to the MFA's YouTube channel at a later date. And when the recording is taking place, you're welcome to turn off your video and mute your audio in order not to be included if you choose. And please know that the majority of the recording will show only the presenter. A couple of other housekeeping items on the next slide. See if we could please have the next, there we go. That you'll note that a transcript and closed captions for this program are available through Rev for Zoom Live Captions. And if you're interested in enabling those captions, you can go to the bottom of the Zoom bar and click on the up arrow next to closed caption and then click on show subtitle. We're going to do our best to say our name when a new speaker begins. And during this session, we invite you to share questions and comments in the chat or use the raise hand function during our Q&A session. We want to thank Sophia Walter for her amazing technical and logistical organization of today's program. Please do feel free to write in the chat if you should need any help during today's program. We can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as this slide suggests, we've got a really robust program of presentations today that will explore professions in conservation. And we really are excited to begin to bring some of this information to our broader audiences. And as always, we're always very interested in hearing from you. So at the end of our session today, you'll be invited to take a short survey, and your responses always help us in developing future programs. And as we move through the program, each of our presenters will share about their own work, as well as their pathway to the careers that they have in museums. As you'll notice from this screen, we're really thrilled to be joined by two former interns at the MFA who spent the summer with us this past summer. So you'll hear from them as well. And we'll have some time for questions at the very end before we wrap up. And as always, if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out in the chat. The first thing we're going to do, and if we could get the next slide as well. Thank you. As I mentioned, our session today is really focused on conservation, which is at the heart of the museum and really core to the mission as a public institution to hold works of art in trust and to ensure their preservation for future generations. So we're thrilled to be able to share with you that after years of planning, we are going to be introducing a new state-of-the-art conservation center in the coming months. You'll notice from this slide that it features a very open floor plan and has a very innovative use of glass walls and was really designed to serve as a dynamic and very interactive hub for conservation and collaboration around science, art, and history. This amazing new center brings together many conservation labs, and you'll certainly hear about that from our presenters today. And it functions to bring together previously scattered areas of conservation into one central location. And it will thus help us foster opportunities for sharing information, for learning from one another, and applying a very cross-disciplinary approach in conservation and problem solving. A couple of other things to note about this new conservation center is that because we are so committed to education and engagement with the public, museum goers, students alike, will have an opportunity to stop into the Robert and Carol Henderson Conservation Learning Center and actually watch conservators at work. In addition to that, programming and interpretive materials will engage visitors of all ages and shed light on the scientific research and methods behind this work. The other feature of this center that's very exciting to share is known as the Pamela and Peter Voss Conservation Seminar Room, where scholars and classes and other groups are going to be able to join in close looking with conservators and make connections between art and STEM disciplines. Within the labs, these new facilities will provide expanded capabilities to train and mentor the next generation of conservators through internships and fellowships as well. And although it has been very much delayed on account of the pandemic, like so many aspects of our lives, we look forward to opening the center's doors to the public next year. And in the meantime, we have a really wonderful short video to share that highlights some of the areas of this very important work. So if we could have the next slide, please, we can play that video. Thank you for showing that. So as you all can see from that video, the world of conservation encompasses a very wide array of practices and approaches in preserving objects in the museum's collection. So without further ado, I'm really, really thrilled to turn it over to my amazing colleagues in conservation, Lindsay Boyer and Eve Mayberger, who will share their thoughts on conservation and their work specifically. So Eve and Lindsay, over to you.
All right, well, thank you all. I'm Eve Mayberger, and I just want to thank Dahlia and Randall for a wonderful introduction. And, it's great to be part of this career panel. We're really excited to be able to have a conversation with all the participants here. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit generally about conservation, and then I will turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay Boyer, who will talk a little bit more specifically about our current project we are working on in the galleries. Next slide, please. So what is conservation? So conservation, this is just like a definition that's taken from our professional organization, the American Institute for Conservation. It's all the actions taken towards the long-term preservation of cultural heritage. And these things can include a variety of things, such as examination, documentation, treatment, preventive care. And it's all of this work is really grounded by research and also like outreach and education initiatives. And so just to kind of as a shorthand, art conservation is really the taking care of valued objects. You can see me here in the image treating one of the Bishamonten sculptures that we'll talk about later. Next slide, please. So the field of conservation is really at the intersection of three discrete disciplines. So we definitely are grounded in the fields of art history, archaeology, kind of knowing the background for the things we're working with. Science, knowing, kind of material science, understanding the chemical processes, the degradation of different materials, and also fine arts. Conservation is very unique in the fact that we actually get to work directly with the artifacts in our care. And so being able and having comfort with doing very kind of manual, fine-tuned technical work is very crucial. So it's really important for those interested in the field to have strong backgrounds in all three of these areas. And if interested in pursuing a career in conservation, there's very strict requirements on entering graduate school for these kind of three different areas. Next slide, please. So just where does Conservators work? So we can work anywhere from, obviously here at the MFA, we're working in a museum environment. There's also private conservation studios, which really focus on smaller collections or private collections. Conservators are also placed in research labs, on archaeological projects, so really in a variety of contexts where we're interested in the preservation long-term care of physical materials. So the training program, it's a master's degree in conservation, and there are a few graduate schools in the United States and abroad that most conservators go to, but it's a very technical field and requires many, many years of intense study and training in addition to a lot of practical experience. One thing that kind of defines us a little bit differently than a lot of other museum careers, especially compared to curatorial departments, is that we specialize by materials. So you'll notice here that Lindsay and I are really focusing on the conservation of three-dimensional objects. And we have colleagues here at the museum, and I think you saw in the recent video, that specialize in paintings, in photographs, in wooden artifacts, textiles, paper. And so when you go to your graduate training, you really focus by material. And it's exciting because we can work on collections from many different cultures and time periods, but our individual expertise is really based in the materiality of the pieces we are working on. And finally, kind of one note I wanted to say, sometimes we're often called restorers. And this is kind of a term that, at least in the English-speaking world, we're kind of moving away from. Mostly because restorers, as you think about the act of restoring something, to what extent, to how the piece looked originally. And as conservators, especially in museum environments, we see these pieces as historical objects, and we really want to kind of conserve what's there. There are times where we do more restorative practices, but we really try to keep that in context, and all our decisions are made in consultation with the museum curatorial department and kind of talking to other experts in the field. Next slide, please. And finally, just because this is a very brief introduction, we want to leave a lot of time for questions. I thought I would just share a little bit of background about how I personally got into the field before handing it over to my colleague, Lindsay Boyer. So I went during my undergraduate, when I was an undergraduate, I initially thought I was going to be a math major. And I showed up the first week of school and I needed to get a work study job. And I just happened to interview and get placed in the preservation department at the library. What started out as just kind of like a work study job turned out to be the thing I looked most forward to in my day. And I kind of became more attuned to the field of conservation and the various requirements. So by halfway through my education in my undergraduate, I had fully switched out of my math major and was taking classes in art history, studio art, and science. And you do have to have a fairly robust science background. So you do have to take organic chemistry. So I definitely remember being like the one kind of non-medical student in my organic chemistry class, but it is useful later. After I finished my undergrad, before applying to graduate school, most of the programs require work in the field. So like working at different museums or historical houses or other kind of institutions, private practices to gain kind of experience in different materials. And they call this the pre-program years. And you'll hear a little bit more about our pre-program interns, Mayuvi and Pilar, later in this panel. So I spent 2 years kind of bouncing around to different opportunities. Basically, I lived out of a suitcase. I moved every few months, but I was able to work at a variety of institutions and get a really good background in the field of conservation, and prepared me for graduate school at New York University or NYU. So NYU is a 4-year graduate program, and your final year is actually a placement in a museum or other institution where you're working full-time with other conservators to kind of really hone your practice. So after those 4 years of graduate school, then I pursued an advanced conservation fellowship at the Museum of Fine Arts. So I actually arrived at the museum almost exactly 5 years ago, like next week or something, as a conservation fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. And it was a great opportunity to kind of continue my educational development, gain more hands-on experience, being able to work with many different conservators. And then 2.5 years ago, I was fortunate to be promoted to an assistant conservation position here, working on this Japanese Buddhist temple project with Lindsay. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay, and I greatly look forward to our conversation later in this session.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lindsay Boyer. I'm an object conservator here at the museum. Can get the next slide. It's just really brief background on me. I took an AP art history course in high school and I really loved it. So I wanted to major in art history when I went to NYU for undergrad, but I wasn't sure what job you could get from that. And I didn't really want to be a teacher. So I applied to the Mcparland Museum of Art's internship program and just was randomly placed with a textile conservator. So I spent the next 4 years during my undergrad time just sort of bouncing around different conservation labs, helping out where people needed things and learning more about the field. And was really, really lucky that right around the time I graduated, they were starting a big renovation of the Pacific galleries and they needed sort of assistance with that. So I got a 3-year position as a conservation preparator, helping with that, which gave me the time to do all those prerequisites that Eve was talking about. At that time, I had to learn German to apply to school, had to do all organic chemistry and everything. So taking all those night classes while working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then I briefly worked at a private studio just to fill in the few months between hearing about whether I'd gotten into grad school for conservation, which I did. And I also went to NYU, the same program that Eve did. Next slide. So I'm going to talk really briefly about the project that Eve and I have been working on. It's focused on the documentation of treatment of 7 Japanese Buddhist sculptures that have been on display in the Temple Gallery for the past few decades at least. The Temple Gallery, in case you don't know, it's Gallery 279. You can see it here in the image. It was built in 1909 to sort of evoke the interior of a Japanese Buddhist temple, to sort of give visitors an impression of what the original environment for these objects would have been. The objects themselves date to the Heian period, which is 9th to 12th century. They're all made of wood. They're decorated with polychromy, which is just paint and gilding. And they were examined in 2017. It was discovered that they had some serious condition issues. There's a lot of dust for one thing. There's a cracking of the wood, a lot of flaking decorative layers, some evidence of insect activity that might have been old, but it sort of weakens the structure of the object. pesticide residue, a lot of things that needed attention really, really quickly. So it was decided that the neighboring gallery, 280, would be converted from a Japanese gallery into sort of a conservation and action space. So we used the cases that were already existing to sort of create a glass enclosed conservation studio where Eve and I are able to do the treatments on these sculptures in full view of the public and sometimes talk with the public about what we're doing. I'm actually in there right now, so you might see people wandering around behind me. Okay, so next slide. So this is one of the objects that's part of this project, Bishamon 10, Guardian of the North. I'm sort of going to use it as an example of some of the activities of the project. So we do a lot of documentation. We do examination and photography in visible light. We do multispectral imaging. You can see the UV image here. We do microscopy. We've been doing photogrammetry, which is a photographic technique to develop 3D models of the sculptures. Radiography, the annotated condition maps you can see here, written reports, a lot of documentation so we really understand the object and understand the condition it's in. We come up with a treatment proposal and then we perform the treatment, which in this case, the decorative surface layers were really, really flaky, like terrifyingly detaching from the wood substrate below them. So it took Eve and I months, both of us working on it to set down all the paint flakes on this guy. So that was a pretty intense project. Go to the next slide. So a couple really interesting collaborations that came out of this treatment in particular. You can see in the radiograph on the right, you can first of all see that the sculpture is hollow. You can also see it's made up of a number of different pieces that were attached together. You can see the joins, it will stay like the shoulders and down the center and a number of other areas. You can also see inside the yellow square, there's a shape in the chest. So when we saw that, we were really interested to see what that might be, especially since the curatorial department suggested it might be a votive plaque that might have information about the object on it. So we wanted to find a way to image it, but unfortunately the head, which at one time had been detachable, had since been nailed in place, and we determined that it was just too dangerous to try to remove those nails, would cause potentially too much damage. So we needed a different way to look at it. So Abby Heiken, our supervisor, got in contact with a renowned pediatric neurosurgeon, Dr. Benjamin Worf at Boston Children's Hospital. And he graciously volunteered his time to show up with a couple pediatric endoscope prototypes along with their developers. And those pediatric endoscopes were small enough to fit through a little narrow gap at the neck. And he stuck it right through the neck and we immediately got to see, if you can play the video. This is the video from the endoscope of what we saw inside. It's definitely a votive plaque in there. It dates to November 25th, 1909, and it basically states that a Japanese sculptor and restorer, Niro Chinosuke, had worked on the sculpture, had performed restoration on the sculpture at 1909 for the museum, which we knew he had been doing work here at that time. We didn't know exactly what he'd done, so this was like finding a 100-year-old condition report in the object, which was really exciting to us. Next slide. So because we have so much outreach as a part of this project, we hear the number one question is, what did these look like originally? So in order to try to address that question, we collaborated with a Brandeis University undergrad student named Jalen Kimes, who had a 3D animation background. And so we worked with the research scientists here to analyze the materials on the sculpture. We also did a lot of examination and we talked to the curatorial department, and with all that together, we put together this 3D color recreation of what we think the original surface of the sculpture may have looked like. And it's also accompanied, as you can see on the lower right, by a confidence heat map. And that's meant to portray our level of confidence that these areas are portrayed correctly. Some areas we're really certain that we got right because a lot of the material is still present. Other areas were a little bit sort of guessing based on other examples of similar objects. So if you can hit play on that. So here's our 3D color recreation model. I think at the moment it is just an image of it is available on the website on our project webpage, but we're hoping to share this video of the model spinning with the public soon. Next slide. So just talking about a couple other activities that conservators are engaged in. And Eve can jump in too if you have anything. There we collaborate with pretty much every department at the museum. We often collaborate actually with living artists as well to discuss the preservation of their objects. A lot of conservators go on archaeological digs at some point in their career. We also engage in preventive conservation, which is trying to prevent the deterioration of an object by controlling its environment, such as controlling humidity, temperature, insect activity, pollutants, that kind of thing. Eve?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can see some photos of all of us at work, and I just want to highlight our two amazing pre-programmed interns who are going to be speaking just after us, that we were really helpful to have them both working on doing some testing for the Buddhist sculptures and also working on the outdoor sculptures. So sometimes we, even as museum workers, we're dealing with things outside in the elements. So like we're really responsible for a whole breadth of material, going from incredibly ancient objects all the way to things that were created this past year. So it is incredibly interesting and constantly learning about different aspects of this work. So I think with that, we're going to transition to our next speakers, but we look forward to engaging more with everyone during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Lindsay and Eve. That was really, really wonderful. Now that we've built our foundation and understanding a little bit more about conservation and looking specifically at the project that you all have worked on together, as well as having an overview here of some of the amazing activities of many in our conservation area, I'm really thrilled to turn it over to two former interns, Mayuli and Pilar, who were with us over the summer. Without further ado, I will turn it over to them to share with us a little bit about what they did over the summer. So Mayuli and Pilar, when you're ready.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Pilar Brooks, and I'm going to be presenting with Mayuli Santiesteban. We were both art conservation interns over this past summer, and we're just going to be telling you a little bit about the projects that we worked on as summer interns and a little bit about what we're doing now. Next slide, please.
So thank you, Eve and Lindsay, for that mention, and thank you, Pilar, for that introduction. So as she said, we will be speaking a bit about what we did this summer. So from June 19 until August 14, Pilar and I were interns for the Objects Conservation Lab. Our main focus during this 8-week internship was documenting, treating, and caring for the outdoor sculptures owned or cared for by the MFA. These were mostly made of bronze and stone, some special cases made of fiberglass, and others with enamel. Each sculpture with its context, environment, degradation, patina, quirky histories, and challenges. As you can see from the pictures, the sculptures could be as big as a giant baby head or as small as a dog, which was really interesting and a very interesting challenge to get used to. And yeah, it was really amazing to work on each of these sculptures and getting to know like each treatment done and the materials we were working with. The most prevalent issue in the bronze sculptures was the failure of a previous coat of acrylic, which is an anti-corrosion coating. That maintenance wasn't able during the last 3 years, which contributed to their state of deterioration. By the end of the internship, we had worked on at least 29 sculptures, most of which we could do treatment on and others that needed only documentation. For all, we did before and after treatment photography, condition reports, and uploaded those files into MFA's archival system, otherwise known as TMS. Of course, besides working on outdoor sculptures, we were also able to participate in other projects and even develop a research about 2 contested monuments at MFA. Next slide, please.
So another project that we worked on in addition to the outdoor sculpture was the Conservation in Action Japanese Buddhist sculpture in a new light with Eve and Lindsay. And this is the pedestal that we were working on, which is a part of a larger Buddhist sculpture. And so we began by doing some examination and research. So we did a condition report, which is a common starting point for conservation work, where you're evaluating the extent and type of damage to the object. We also did an annotated diagram of the object using some photography to show more specifically where the damage was located. And in the picture on the left there, we are taking some images using a dino light, which is a handheld microscope with a flashlight that we use to get some close-up images to have a closer and more detailed look at the damage. And we also went through some of the previous research that had been done, like material analysis and other condition reports by conservators to compile previous looks and perspectives on the pedestal in a report that we put into the museum database at the end of our internship. And then here on the right, Lindsay is showing us a technique called Shimbari. Shimbari is a Japanese technique that places an even amount of pressure over a non-flat surface using a wooden frame and either bamboo or fiberglass rods. So here we're using fiberglass rods. And for this, we did a lot of different kind of spot tests on the back pedals of the pedestal that wouldn't be as visible. And we were testing things like different thicknesses of fiberglass rods to apply tension and applying different materials in different orders in order to adhere flaking lacquer back onto the piece and consolidate it. And another thing that is not pictured here that we did during the Japanese Buddhist sculpture in a new light project is we were able to do some images using infrared reflectography on the interior of one of the sculptures, which you can kind of see behind us in these two photos. The Buddha is sort of lying on his back. And we were able to take images of a transcription on the inside, and using the infrared reflectography, we got images that were clear enough that the curatorial department was able to begin translating using those images. So that was really exciting. And we're ready for the next slide now.
So as I mentioned earlier, another part of our internship was developing research on 2 contested monuments at the MFA. So we were able to do this on Fridays because from Monday through Thursday, we were working mainly on the outdoor sculptures or other projects going around at the MFA or getting tours of the labs, which was also very fun. And yeah, so on Fridays, we did the research mainly. These objects that we researched were Cyrus Dowling's Appeal to the Great Spirit, done in 1908, which you can see on the first image on the left, and the John Endicott Memorial by Ralph Paul Gray and Carl Paul Genowin, done in 1937. With this research, we decided to focus on their historical context of acquisition or creation, their previous treatments, and possible outcomes for their futures. Pilar and I were able to, each of us were able to develop a page essay in which we thoroughly explored said objectives and even present our findings via a Zoom conference at MFA. In addition to our main focuses of the internship, outdoor sculpture, and the research, our supervisors made sure that we were able to see and participate in other projects taking place at the museum. But the very important thing about this research was that even though both of these monuments were from very different contexts and in very different times, they both presented harmful imagery to Native American communities. And in the research, we were able to investigate how and why these monuments came to be and their future and possible outcomes for their futures. Next slide, please.
And these were just some other projects that we were able to be involved with in addition to our 3 main projects throughout our internship. So on the 2 bottom images in the bottom left and the bottom right corner, you can see that we did some 3D modeling on the Scholar's Rock, which is another object in the outdoor sculpture collection. So the left image is Eve holding a scanner, and we used a 3D scanner as well as 3 different types of cameras to collect images to then input into a software program to create 4 different 3D models. And we wanted to see which technique, the scanner versus the 3 different cameras, would yield the most accurate results, which could yield the best color, which could yield the most precision in looking at degradation on the sculpture over time, in order to figure out which of these techniques would be best for doing continual conservation monitoring, or also other things like using 3D models in presentations like the one that we're giving now, or creating merchandise and things like that, because depending on the specific outcome that you want from the 3D model, it can be better to have a more accurate and time-intensive approach, or it can be better to do an easier, quicker version and sacrifice a little bit of accuracy. Also, when we are examining a couple of the sculptures, like the fiberglass sculpture here that Mayuli and I are looking at, we were able to go up on the lift, which was a really cool experience and also just really useful in bringing it forward in case in future internships or jobs we're working on really large scale objects where we do need to go up in a lift again. We have had that experience. And then finally, the center image shows a housing that Mayuli created for a small object just from one of our coworkers' desks. And this was helping us learn how at the museum they create housing for the objects when they are not in display and are in storage, and how they can be preserved and kept in good shape through proper housing. Okay, next slide, please.
So now at present time, after finishing that great internship, I am working towards applying to grad school for the first time, which is why I am very grateful to have been able to participate in the outdoor sculpture summer internship at the MFA. The materials learned not only enhanced my application, our application, but further showed me how much I enjoy this work. Besides developing that application, I volunteer as an ECPN Puerto Rican liaison, which ECPN is the Emerging Conservation Professionals Network. And I also volunteer at the National Park Service Cannon Restoration Project and work part-time at a private practice for objects conservation. In the pictures, you can see me working with a painting on the further left corner, and with a cannon on the bottom, and doing a little bit of coil pottery on the top again, which, yeah.
And I am also currently working towards applying for grad school. So I'm enrolled in the organic chemistry that Eve mentioned. It's been lovely. And I am also the ECPN liaison for Orlando, and I am a book and paper conservation intern at the Minnesota Historical Society at the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. So in the top image, I am surface cleaning a map, just removing some of the surface debris and excess dirt. And then in the bottom left image, that is another map that is in a humidifier. So they are placed in humidifiers in order to kind of soften them and allow them to lay flat. This particular map had been rolled up as a scroll, and so it was really difficult to access without risking further damage and tearing to the map. And then finally, on the bottom right corner, that is a map that I did some paper repair on. It's kind of difficult to see because that is part of the point, is that the repair should be difficult to see, but you can kind of see along the edge where there is some Japanese tissue paper poking through some of the tears that didn't completely reconnect together. And so that will just keep those tears together without risking causing any further damage to the map. And that concludes our presentation. So we can move on to the next presenters now. Thank you.
Pilar and Mayuli, I know that I'm joined by as many attendees as we have, 64 in applauding. That was really, really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us and your experience at the museum. We miss seeing you around the building, but we're so, so thrilled that you could share with us so much of the work that you did over the summer in such a hands-on and very intellectually stimulating way. that clearly has set you up for the new path ahead. And I know there will be lots of questions for you all as well. So as we move on, it's a real pleasure to introduce our next presenters who do a really, really, really amazing job at the museum that operates best when it disappears. And it's such a pleasure to be able to introduce their work, Brett Angel and Kimberly Mcparland. I'm thrilled to turn it over to both of you.
Thank you, Dahlia. Hello, everyone. I'm Brett Angel. I'm Senior Exhibitions Preparator for Objects at the museum. Generally, preparator can mean many things, but what I can guarantee is it will be a lot of objects handling, a lot of object movement, a lot of working in the gallery, preparing the galleries, but also a lot of back of house things too, where you're working on the objects outside of the gallery. And also, I've worked in a few museums now, and preparator can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different institutions. I've worked at smaller institutions where the preparator also hangs sheetrock, muds joints, taping, paint, and does demolition. And then in larger institutions like the MFA, you become much more specialized. Next slide, please. So what exactly is a mount maker and what is a mount? Most people don't know. And in fact, before I started working at the MFA, I had never heard of it before in my life. So here's my colleague, Kimberly. And I thought, which you'll be hearing from her in a minute. I thought this would be a perfect image to show what exactly a mount is. So this was Kim working in our version of the Ancient Nubian exhibition. That was a couple of years ago now. But if you look towards the back of the case, kind of towards the left of the image, you can see all kinds of necklaces and bracelets. And as you look closer to us at the right side of the image, you can see all kinds of little metal armatures. So those little metal armatures on the right are what Kim and I do, and that's essentially what a mount is. Mounts don't necessarily have to be metal. They can be acrylic, they can be foam, they can be all kinds of other materials, but I would say 90% of the time Kim and I use brass for our fabrication. Mounts generally, at least in our institution, are used both for safety to help support fragile objects, but also for design and curatorial purposes. So like in this instance, I know many times when you go to other museums, you often see objects just sitting on the deck. And at the MFA, curators and designers here really like to animate objects. And so you can see here that the necklaces are bumped out from the wall. And particularly with necklaces, if they're not on a body hanging around your neck, they just lay limp and flat. And so you don't get a true sense of what they can do. And so in this image, you can see how they're not only bumped out from the wall so that they have some weight and dimension to them, but it also gives you kind of a sense of what it would look like if it were on a body. And in addition to exhibition, we also make mounts for storage. We make mounts for traveling and crates. And we also travel tons of exhibitions. So Kim and I are quite busy. My path to mount making is quite diverse. I'm not sure if it represents what most people's paths would be, but when I was an undergraduate in Milwaukee, my first kind of official art job was working in a small independent frame shop that did high-end museum quality framing for museums in the area and collectors. And that was kind of my first experience with working with kind of museum quality and what we call archival framing. After that, I moved to, or actually after that, I started my graduate research also in Milwaukee as a painter. And I got a project assistantship at the university and in the museum there. And that particular museum had 3 separate galleries that we're in charge of. And so that was kind of my first awakening to the larger world out there. And at that job, I got to work with such great painters as the Chicago painter Roger Brown, who's sadly no longer with us. But that was really, for me, not only as an artist, but as a museum professional, it was so fantastic to work with someone of that caliber and also work with their personal collection. After that, when I graduated, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, and I then worked at a museum, which was then called the Madison Art Center. It's now called the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art. And again, kind of think of each of these jobs as expanding concentric circles. My eyes were opening even further as I worked there as an installer or preparator in installing the exhibitions. And it was even, the circle expanded even further because I got to work with even larger artists like the video installation artist Bill Viola, which was just the largest thing I had ever worked to up to that point, and it was quite daunting. But when you work with other people, you can kind of rest on their shoulders and learn from them. After that, I moved to Minneapolis, where I worked at the Walker Art Center. And there I installed the exhibitions. And then when the exhibitions were installed, I would switch and work at the frame shop there. And again, just thinking of it as expanding concentric circles, I worked with huge exhibitions and artists that were no longer alive, but just incredible exhibitions. And so with each kind of progressive step, you get further and further, you learn more knowledge and you get further and further closer to what you want to do. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be fun to show you something that I'm working on current project. This is a terracotta piece, a baby Eros, that we're working on installing the renovation of our ancient Greek and Roman galleries right now. And so, as you can imagine, it's amazing that a piece like this even survives. And so we often work very closely with conservators like Eve and Lindsay, because they will in fact tell us where the breaks are in the piece, where things have been repaired, areas we should stay away from, areas that are safe to work on. And so in this particular case, you sometimes have to be very creative. You want to stay away from limbs and things like that tend to be more fragile. And so this piece happened to have a firing hole in it, which is the large hole in the back in the center image. And so I decided that the best way to secure this object would be to somehow grab that. And so you can see I'm holding a little mechanism, which I'll show you shortly in the next slide what exactly is going on there. But that's how the piece is secured. And then on the image on the right, if you see that little brass piece going up the back, that's how that attaches to the object and then secures it to the deck. So next slide, please. So here's the little mechanism I was talking about. And sometimes you have to get quite complicated like this. In general, Kim and I kind of have a rule that we try to stay as simple as you can, because the more complicated you get, the more things can go wrong. However, in this case, everything worked out fine. But what I'm trying to show you here is if you look on the right, there's a little almost peg that comes down on the bottom, and that part goes inside of the firing hole. And then if you look on the image on the left, the two horizontal brass pieces that are sticking out to the left and right keep that little medallion from falling inside the piece. And then the part on the top that looks like an oval, kind of a round shaped piece of metal, that's attached to a threaded screw. And so that turns down so that the piece can be put inside the object. And then once it's rested in the hole of the object, you can turn it and flip it up, and that prevents the piece from falling out. Next image, please. And then here it is, just recently installed last week. The image on the left is the particular Eros that I was working on, but we also have a mate, the one on the right. So not only is it rare to have such a detailed, fragile terracotta object, but we have a pair of them. And so the image on the left is how they look from the front, and then on the back, you can see the finished mounts, how they kind of sneak up the back. They're painted the color, which Kim is going to talk a lot about in painting, but they're painted out so that you don't notice it as much. So the job is fantastic. The one thing I should mention, kind of as a little bit of a reality check, if you're a person like me that can't sit behind a computer and a desk all day, this is a great job. I'm an artist myself, so it's fantastic to be able to handle all these objects. We work with every department in the museum, so we work from everything to ancient Nubian objects, as you saw in the first slide, which are like 3,000 years old, to contemporary, to paintings, to everything in between. So it's definitely not a dull job. The reality check part is, you won't probably make a ton of money unless you're a director or a chair of a department. But if you can find a balance like I did that has both an okay pay and just fantastic, interesting job, then this is the job for you. So now I'd like to introduce Kimberly Mcparland, my colleague.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Mcparland, and I am an exhibitions preparator as well here at the MFA. I have been here about 19 years, but a mount maker for about 10. I have a BFA with a concentration in sculpture, so that kind of works well with working with your hands and creating mounts. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to take this off. So my path to mount making is I started here as a assistant in objects conservation, and throughout my time doing that, I kind of had a change of heart and decided that it wasn't the direction I wanted to head in. And so I moved into a more generalized collections care position And while doing that, I got my first experience mount making when I was making mounts to display some amazing works of art that were created by students from the Perkins School for the Blind. And I really loved doing it. So when a position opened up here for mount making, I jumped on the opportunity and was fortunate enough to get it. Just as an aside, there is actually no formal path towards mount making as a career. There are some courses and classes that you can take throughout the world, short-term stuff, but there isn't a degree program or sort of a straightforward career path to getting there. So most mount makers or preparators that you talk to will have very different backgrounds and interesting ways of how they ended up where they are. That doesn't mean that, you can't do it too. It just means that, you're not going to plan out your schooling and then your career, and, it's not a direct line. So one of the things I like most about working here at this museum is that it's so big and we have such a variety in our collection. We work with, as was mentioned, with art from all different time periods and genres and cultures, but we get this wonderful and unique intimacy to experience when we hold each object and work with it, making mounts. So we get to see every single little detail up close and learn a lot about each object and its history. Because the collection is so vast, it's constantly presenting us with new challenges, and it keeps it really interesting. And new gallery and exhibition designs require us to innovate and come up with novel ways to design and fabricate mounts all the time. So that also keeps it interesting and exciting. So mount makers kind of have a motto that, as Dahlia mentioned, if we do our work well, you don't notice it, which is kind of ironic, but that's sort of the words that we live by. So in addition to creating, as Brett mentioned, mount designs that are minimal and low profile as possible, we paint them. And how we do that is critical into their being invisible, or at least not distracting to the viewer. So to accomplish this, we use color matching and brushing and sponging techniques, layering, fine detail painting. The diversity of objects that we make mounts for provides a broad range of materials for us to try to mimic. And there's so many different textures and patterns and finishes. So painting a mount is a multi-step process. First, we clean and prepare the metal for painting after we've fabricated the mount. Then we spray it with an acrylic primer, which provides a smooth surface and also helps with the bonding between the metal and the paint. We use acrylic paints to apply color and decoration and create the surface and texture of the object. And then finally, we give it a protective clear coating to match the finish of the object. So I have found a couple of photographs of mounts that I've worked on that give an example of some of the diversity of the materials that we work with. So this first slide here is showing a musical instrument. I've listed here the numerous materials it's made from, but in terms of the painting, in order to get the look of the varnished woods, I use several layers of lightly pigmented acrylic mediums. And it's a technique that you have to be very careful with, because if you go too far when you're doing it, meaning you add too many layers, you lose not only the translucency, but also the variations of the color in the wood. So you can't go back from that. You have to actually remove it and start over. And then I use a variety of different brushes and techniques to sort of give the indication of wood grain. On the lower left hand, you see a detail of the black and white striping on the edge of the instrument. The mounts that we use or that we make, this one in particular has a curved surface, which makes that striping really difficult to get to line up. The metal that we use, the brass we use, is flat or round or curved, and applying lines and details to that metal, the shape of it or the thickness can affect how the details line up with the actual object. Another thing that adds to that level of difficulty is that the viewer's line of sight also comes into play. So whether an object is going to be displayed high or low or at eye level in a gallery will affect how the painting on the mount matches up. Next slide, please. So here are two examples of ceramics with very different finishes. The one on the top is a high fire ceramic with enamel decoration and a glossy finish. And the one on the lower area is a low fire pottery with a slip decoration and a very matte surface. This is on the lower, the images on the lower part of the screen give another example of how the sight line can affect how things line up. So on the picture on the left, the view is straight on and the lines look pretty good in terms of lining up with the pottery itself. But as you move your sight line to the right, you can see how the lines start coming out of alignment with the decoration on the object. Next slide, please. This is a contemporary piece made of copper. The surface ranges from shiny and smooth copper to textured corrosion with a very matte finish. The corrosion products themselves offer a variety of colors and textures. And to create this, I used a sponge and many, many layers of paint and color. Next slide, please. And this is the last example I'll show. It is this pair of beaded leather bags. The mixed media always presents an extra challenge for us when we're trying to paint out mounts. So here I had to sort of create the illusion that the beads are three-dimensional and also sitting on top of the leather surface. Fortunately, not all objects are this complex because painting hundreds of individual beads takes a really long time. And I can't justify spending that much time in every mount. But I happened to have a rare bit of extra time while I was making this. So I indulged myself and kind of went all out. But if I did all mounts at this level of detail, we would never keep up with the volume of mounts that we have to make each year. So if I didn't have the time, it would be perfectly acceptable to just paint the beaded areas by blocking out the shape and the color of that and sort of let it blend in that way. And one other factor that I didn't really have a slide to give an example of is when you're painting mounts is lighting. So we tend to paint in natural light as much as possible because colors are most true in a natural light. But in a gallery setting, the lighting can be designed so very warm or cold in temperature or even tinted with color. And even the different levels of light can impact how color looks in the gallery. So sometimes you can really nail something in the studio and you get it into the gallery conditions and they don't look quite as nice. So that's something that's totally out of our control, but can also interfere with the success of our disappearing act. So that's it. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you so much, Brett. It was really, really wonderful. And I know I have a lot of questions for you, but I would love to open it up to our participants and encourage you all to write into the chat your questions, or feel free to use the raise hand function and we can call on you that way. And you're welcome to pose questions for any of our speakers today. Let's see if I have anything yet in the chat. Looks like we have a question for Pilar and Mayuli. What are your backgrounds? Tell us a little bit about where you studied and what you studied.
You want to go first, Pilar?
So I have a BA in art history from Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. And before my internship at the MFA Boston, I was a registration intern at the Harn Museum of Fine Art in Gainesville. So that's kind of how I initially got experience with art handling and doing condition reports. And then before that, I did some other jobs and internships in galleries and in the education department. Yeah, I'll let Mayuli give you a little bit more about her.
So I started getting involved in conservation in my second year of my bachelor degree. I have a bachelor degree in interdisciplinary natural sciences from Puerto Rico. And I started with science-based research on preserving cultural heritage. And from then on, I started working at the museum of my college and then started working for private practice, did an internship conservation. It was a conservation internship for broadening access at the Smithsonian. I did a 10-week internship there in the National Museum of Natural History, the one from the movie. And after that, I did the 8-week internship at the MFA.
Great. Thank you both so much. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and then we've got a raised hand from Elliot O'Connell. So Elliot, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay, cool. My question is mostly for Brett, but anybody can jump in and answer it. I am currently I am getting my bachelor's in art history right now, and you kind of mentioned like getting a lot of hands-on experience, and I've heard like other people in this field like mentioning that they were very helped by like apprenticeships and like really working in person, and I was wondering if you had any advice on like seeking an apprenticeship after finishing your degree.
It's a great question. And in fact, one part I didn't mention about when I started at the MFA, when I first came here with 10 years of experience, there were no openings in the areas that I had experience in. So I just hopped on in the protective service area as a gallery guard, and actually ended up having to do that for 3 years and applying for 13 jobs before I finally got in. So, and that wasn't even the job I'm in now. That was just as a kind of a generic collections care handling person. So I would say to alleviate those kinds of wait times, definitely being in the right place at the right time is part of it, which is a little bit of luck, but also who you know. So definitely it's important to introduce yourself, even in larger museums. And while Kim and I don't have an internship program, just for many reasons, because of lack of time to spend with people, but also our job has a lot of dangers in it too, that you don't want to unnecessarily risk people to using torches and power tools and things like that. But it's important to meet people and talk to people, and that helps give you a leg up, because as you know, once you get out into the real big bad world, you're in competition with hundreds, if not thousands of other people. And so you need to find some small way to not get lost in the mix, kind of like I did. And so I would strongly suggest, even in big institutions like the MFA, to just introduce yourself to people, whether it be through email or personally, but also, volunteer your time. Although I'm happy to say at the MFA, we now pay our volunteers we pay our interns. So it's no longer just, you work for free like it used to be. So I'm very happy to say that we offer that here. But that would be my biggest suggestion, is just really introduce yourself to as many people as you can, meet as many people as you can, because you never know when a job's going to open, and you never know when someone's going to say, hey, I remember Elliot, like I talked to her 2 years ago, like maybe I'll look at her resume or whatever. So I think that's really the most important part, because again, when I first came to the MFA, I didn't even know what malt making was a job. So obviously I couldn't really prepare for it because I didn't know. And so everything I learned on the job. So it's really about being in the right place at the right time, but also meeting and introducing yourself to as many people as you can.
Thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead, Kim, please.
If I could just add to that, there are some courses and things, if it's mount making in particular that you're interested in, that you can pursue without sort of being in any kind of program or having a job doing mount making or that sort of thing, but also sort of parallel skills. Somebody who joined the large mount making team recently had taken upon himself to do a lot of welding and learn a lot of welding. The woman who was in my position before me had done a lot of jewelry making, so soldering and things like that. So there are skills and things that you can sort of hone in the meantime that will just also help you get a little bit of an edge over maybe some people that have little to no experience.
Thank you both. That's really helpful. So we have a question from Autumn Handley in the chat. And the question is, I'm interested in conserving art within private collections. How would you recommend connecting to collectors? I don't know if Eve and Lindsay, maybe you'd like to take this.
I can probably answer this one. Before working here, I worked for a private conservation studio in New York City for about 7 years. We were the largest objects conservation private studio in the region, and we worked with a number of smaller institutions that didn't have their own conservation staff, auction houses, galleries, and then a lot of private collectors. So I believe the way that we found most of those clients was that we we were working for the auction houses and the dealers that these collectors were working with. And so when they would ask their dealer for recommendation of who to ask to take care of the art, the dealer would say, well, I use, the Art Conservation Group was the name of the company I worked for. So I think that's how we found most of our clients. It's actually, so the whole working in the private conservation world is like, it's still different in a lot of ways. You do a lot more treatment time, a lot less research. Like the time is money thing. So you have to sort of plow through treatments a lot quicker. But on the plus side, you see a lot of stuff, and you see a lot of stuff in private collections in these people's amazing apartments. It's like their amazing mansions, and it's really, that part of it's really fun.
Yeah, and I would just kind of jump in with that. Like, one thing that, if people have private collections and are interested in trying to have some conservation work done or some assessments or kind of just general conservation care, we have a professional group for conservators and collections care people called the American Institute for Conservation. I mentioned it in my presentation. And there is a tool called like Find a Conservator tool, which is a way to kind of find lists of people that, do have the background and skills to provide, good advice and kind of good work. Because there are people out there that are working much more in kind of a restoration space, which is very different than kind of most of our job as a conservation professional. So I hope that answers your questions, Adam.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Lindsay. Our next question was addressed in a couple of ways, both by Brett and Kim, but I wonder if it might be more, if we could say more to this question from Ashley Blake about, is it possible to get a career in this field without attending graduate school? So maybe we can think about it from the point of view of preparators, mount making, and then if we could also maybe address it from the perspective of conservation and collections management, that'd be great.
Well, I'll jump in first, and you're in luck if you're interested in mount making, particularly because you don't, as Kim mentioned, there's no kind of educational career path. And in fact, both Kim and I have studio arts degrees, and that's generally what people are looking for in kind of general like art handling, preparator, mount making types of jobs, is just people with hand skills, but you don't necessarily need a graduate degree to get that. And there is at least one person here that doesn't have, in fact, I'm not even sure they have an undergraduate degree, and that it doesn't, honestly, for those types of jobs, it doesn't matter, because you're not needing to know a lot of sciences and things like that, other than maybe in the mount making, how metal and things like that work.
Within like the conservation world, the vast majority of conservators now do have graduate degrees. So the profession does come out of a more craft-based tradition. In this country, the first graduate programs were established in the 1960s. And so there are a few conservators that are still working that are what we call like apprentice trained, but they are becoming fewer and fewer, far between. The vast majority of conservators now, and I'm hard to think of an exception of someone that I would consider kind of a peer, almost all go through one of the major graduate programs. That being said, sometimes there's very, very specialized, unique things that have alternative pathways, but for the vast majority of things as a professional conservator, you do require graduate training. That being said, there are other realms within kind of the broader collection care umbrella that do have alternative pathways that don't require so much formal education, but do rely on significant work experience. So I don't know, Lindsay, if there's any. Mayuri, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can also add to that it depends on where you want to establish. There are certain countries where you only with a bachelor degree in art conservation, or Mexico, you can work in conservation only with that bachelor degree. But it's like an apprenticeship. It also has science, but it's not as science-based as the graduate programs in the US, but you can work with that only a bachelor's degree. And it depends on like which country you want to establish yourself.
Right, and that's really true. Thanks for jumping in, Mayuri. Because there are different It's not like there are like national, international standards per se. So different countries have different kind of requirements or kind of expectations for working as a conservator. So it is something to pay attention to. But for the United States, it's mostly graduately trained conservators now.
Thank you. Really helpful to hear from multiple points of view. Does anyone else want to contribute to that question? Okay, moving on to the next. Okay.
Also, that there are graduate schools that will pay for your learning. Like you would have a full scholarship, or it would be more accessible to certain students to get that graduate degree.
Yeah, and that's something that, while you've heard kind of Lindsay in our class and Mayuli and Pilar's, is this extensive amount of requirements to get into graduate school, and years of pre-program experience are often cases. However, if you do get into any of the American programs, of which there are kind of 4 major ones, they all are funded and they all have living stipends. So you don't necessarily need to take out loans, but they're not generously compensated, but you can make it work. That is not true if you decide to train in like the UK, which we have a number of, if you move to another country, it's not necessarily the case.
Thank you. So in our next question, Kristen Marchetti asks, I was wondering about the role of historical research in art conservation projects at the MFA. Do you typically research the historical context of the artwork prior to proceeding with conservation treatment projects? So maybe Eve or Lindsay, I know that when you had been working on the project in the Japanese Buddhist temple room, there's quite a lot of research. I don't know if you want to address that, and maybe Pilar and Mayuli, if you would want to talk about links that you found between research that you did in objects that you worked on over the summer as well. That'd be great.
I guess the answer is ideally yes. You would take the time to really understand the historical context of the work of art. That can definitely inform treatments. You learn more about materials and what the intended appearance and usage of the object was. That's definitely all very useful information in coming up with a treatment plan. On some occasions, there just isn't time to do a lot of that. So I would say probably for the summer when we were doing outdoor sculpture, we had 29 sculptures to get through in 8 weeks, was it? So so we were basically just like all out trying to just get through it. So we learned like when they were made and what they're made of and who the sculptor was, maybe a little bit about it, but we didn't have time to do a ton of research in that circumstance.
And Mayuli or Pilar, would either of you want to address how maybe the act of doing research on those contested monuments informed your understanding of that process, even if it meant you weren't working directly on those objects?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about that. What I would say is that for contested monuments in particular and other objects that, wait, can you guys hear me? I can't tell if you can. Okay. But for contested monuments and other art historical objects and works of art that have kind of objectionable or offensive origins potentially, I think knowing the history is really important. There's a lot of ongoing conversations taking place in the world of conservation right now about what is the appropriate way to treat these objects and whether or not they should be held to the exact same ethical standards as the way that conservators would treat other objects that have different contexts. And so I found that while Mayuli and I were researching the contested monuments, speaking to people outside of conservation and hearing about the research that they had done, like Tess Lukey in the curatorial department was a really helpful resource for Mayuli and I was able to do an informational interview with her that was really helpful. And then also just learning more about the origins of the pieces, about the sculptors and the architect who worked on each of the pieces, why they were commissioned, and the amount of information that we had on each of the pieces that really shaped my personal opinions and how they should be treated in the future and the place that they should have in the museum. And I think that that experience will shape the way that I approach conservation further along my career and the types of actions that I would advocate for.
Yeah, so like generally it depends on the type of project that is taken on and how time sensitive it is. Also just the amount of knowledge you have. You do have to have a lot of history knowledge. So it depends on like which area you focus on and where are you coming from. But typically it's general historical information about the artwork that is being treated. And if you have time to do a further or more thorough research like we had for the contested monuments, that is done. But it depends on like the project and the time you have for that project.
Thank you both so much. That's something that certainly struck me in all of the presentations, was how do you balance the goals of the project with the time that you have available? I would imagine that that is something that is unique both to every project, but also to different teams and institutions as well. So our next question is from Rachel Nelson, and it's related to this idea of pre-program training. She says, hello and thank you to all of the presenters today. What kind of opportunities do you foresee becoming available at the MFA in the future? Do you have any recommendations for people having difficulty obtaining pre-program experience? So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah,
Eve,
that's a very good question, and something that I think all of us that have gone through this can really sympathize with, because unfortunately there is many people interested in the field of conservation, and unfortunately very few opportunities and even fewer that are compensated. So as kind of Brett and Ken mentioned, just thinking about things you can do outside, even if you can't get a more formal internship, you know, whether it's taking jewelry classes or becoming familiar, like that can all be really great things to do. I mean, to your specific question about things coming up at the MFA, that's not really something we have in control of. Traditionally, objects conservation has tried to host summer interns, and that's something that we will hopefully be able to do going forward continuously. There was a bit of a hiatus with the pandemic for a few years, but we were really happy to have Mayuri and Pilar join us last summer. And I know we currently have a part-time pre-program intern in furniture conservation, so there are occasional opportunities that do arise, but unfortunately we don't have anything more like continually than that. So I really recommend to just kind of pay attention. I see that Michaela Paulson from ECPN, this Emerging Conservation Professionals Network, put in a link in the chat. There can be really a lot of great information that goes out on some of their channels about pre-program opportunities. So I recommend kind of being plugged into the ECPN network, and that's free to join. You don't even have to be a paying member of AIC, so that can be a great place to find more information. But it is extremely competitive, and it's something that we do hear a lot. So.
I know during my sort of pre-program years, I did a lot of unpaid internships just all over the place. And whenever I went somewhere new, I just cold called their conservation labs at the museums in the area and just asked for tours, which was just interesting in its own right. But also I just got to meet a lot of people in the hope that, you know, if they ever had an opportunity, they would, you know, recognize my name. And I think in general, people are pretty generous with their time. If you just say, you know, it doesn't have to be museums, it can be private or private conservators or anything. Generally, if you say you're interested and you'd love to see what they do, that people will accommodate you.
Yeah, and the other thing I often recommend people, I think people really think about museums as the place they want to be, and so they really focus on that. However, if you play a numbers game, there's a lot more like libraries out there in the world, and there's a lot more like oftentimes like, you know, working for historical societies or like, you know, within library collections. That's how I got my start, and there can be a lot more opportunities there, even if you end up moving into something. Like all experience is good when you're starting out, even if it's not necessarily a specialty that you are particularly drawn to, like you will use it later. So I do recommend thinking about things outside the museum that are in like the larger cultural heritage sector.
Thank you. Really, really helpful. And on that note, and of course, oh, Mayuli, please.
Yeah, I would recommend if you're starting out now that you can place yourself in a job or opportunity that would help you connect with conservators or something related to that, but not necessarily you have to start in a conservation internship. Like, for example, Pilar did gallery work and she also worked in libraries. So there are other institutions that will help you connect to conservation and not necessarily starting there. But you do, like Eve said, you do have to at least know a little bit of your strengths and where do you want to end up to place yourself in those places.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that as well. Looking at collections care and registration departments in museums and looking at libraries or government or history centers that will have an archival collection of some kind. Those can be great places to look because even though they might not have a conservation department and you might not be doing conservation work, you might have the opportunity to handle art, and that will give you important hand skills that can possibly give you a leg up over other people applying for conservation internships down the line. And also, like Mayuli said, like if you can just even place yourself in proximity to people, that can be really good. Like the first job I ever had was as an assistant in the education department, and I was doing like education programming, which is not related to conservation at all. But then because I did that job, that's how I met like the owner of a gallery, and I started interning at the gallery and doing gallery cleaning and condition reports for him. And then I got the registration internship, which was a little bit closer, and I was able to do that because I had experience with gallery cleaning and like packing photographs and things like that. And then I got the internship at the MFA.
Really excellent advice. Thank you all so much. It's really about understanding the broader ecosystem, right? And sort of learning about it from different points of view. And of course, there's never necessarily a right answer to this question, but with regard to unpaid internships, Laura Ganschow asks, would you suggest taking an unpaid internship if it's at a place that you like and will give you skills? What do you all think?
I would say,
Go ahead, Brett.
I would say that depends on up to you personally. I mean, I think if I wanted a job bad enough or I wanted to get in somewhere bad enough, I would probably do it. Although I'm happy to say the MFA has changed that policy and I'm hoping other museums will follow as well.
I think it would be great to say, no, your time is worth money and your work is valuable and institutions should respect that. On the other hand, if you're really trying to get into the programs, a lot of them do sort of look for a pre-program experience. And if you can't find one that's compensated, you might have to decide whether you're in a position to be able to do an unpaid internship, but a lot of people aren't. So it's kind of unfortunately, uneven playing field at the moment.
Yeah, and it's something that AIC and there's been within, I think, a lot of the museum sector, there's a lot of conversation about it because it does really limit access to things. For those of you who are still in various undergraduate institutions, I do also recommend sometimes you can get funding from your home universities to pursue unpaid internships. Like I've worked with people where that's been successful, at least for a summer. So you can also think about how to make that work. But generally speaking, it is a problem within the field. And it kind of leads to something that Brett said that I feel we need to reiterate, that specifically for conservation, it is a very specialized field with a lot of training, many years of experience. And at the end of the day, it's even after you make it through the hurdles getting into graduate school and all your training, it can be very difficult to find a job. And the jobs that do exist generally are not compensated well. So it's something that, just in full transparency, for people to really have their eyes open when they start going down this path. It is a very rewarding career. And we work with some amazing collections and have amazing colleagues, but just, think about it pragmatically, like how long can you do it? Like I lived for years living in 2 suitcases and moving every 2 months. I basically did every badly paid internship on the East Coast, and that comes at a price, and encourage everyone to think very long and hard about it, because it is the reality, unfortunately.
Super important. And I think one of the elements to this program is that we do want to be transparent, right, about the work that we do, and certainly about the paths and about the realities. So I do appreciate that very much. And Pilar, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I have done several unpaid internships, and I just wanted to say I definitely understand that not everyone can afford to do unpaid internships, but I think if you can afford it, a lot of the times, like all of my experiences as being an unpaid intern were really good because, you know, I was working for other people who had done the same things that I did, had also experienced doing unpaid internships, and were in an arts career that, you know, where they are not well compensated and a lot of the times have families. So a lot of the times they're really understanding. And if you need to take a job to be able to support yourself, like a lot of them, the hours are flexible and you're not working very many hours per week. When I was a registration intern, I was only working 2 days per week. And then when I was a gallery intern, I was only working 12 hours per week. So it was possible for me to work in addition to be doing those internships. And especially if you don't take classes over the summer, that can be a really great time to try and arrange to have like a part-time job and then also be doing an unpaid internship on the side, if that's not something that you can manage to do during the school year. And yeah, like I definitely advocate for paid internships, but while we're looking at kind of like thinking about financial planning and financial compensation, another thing to think about too is that what I've been doing now, because there's not a lot of paid opportunities in Florida and there's not a lot of conservation opportunities in Florida in general, is doing what Eve mentioned, which is moving around all the time to different paid internships. And that takes a serious financial toll as well that you have to keep in mind. Like to move to St. Paul, I spent $2,000 before I ever received my first paycheck because I had to put a down payment down for an apartment. Like, so, you know, that both paid and unpaid internships can have serious financial challenges. And that's something to keep in mind.
Really important to keep all those considerations at play. Thank you so much for such rich perspectives. We are running a little bit low on time. So I would like to get to a couple of questions that have just come up in the chat. One is related to the type of science courses that you all think someone who is currently a studio art and art history double major and might be a little less comfortable with science. What kinds of science courses do you think this person might be expected to take?
In general, for applications to graduate programs, you need 2 semesters of general chemistry and 2 semesters of organic chemistry. So you will have had to take that before submitting your application to most of at least the programs in this country.
And you need the lab, so you can't get out of the labs. And honestly, the field is going more scientific. So I always tell people, the more science you have, the better. It will make graduate school easier. Graduate school is hard enough.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there's a question that's come in also with regard to advice on someone looking to follow into art conservation later in life. This person says that they are in their 30s and has a bachelor's degree in art conservation from a foreign university. It has been a while since they've been in college and their experiences in a foreign context. What advice might you give to this person?
Yeah, so this is something I think kind of alluding to different countries having different training paths to be a conservator. So it's really dependent on where you're coming from, because sometimes it can be really hard, even if you are trained, even if you have, say, a PhD in conservation from Italy, for example. It's one of the few countries that grants PhDs. Like, so much of it is based on kind of who you know and kind of the network that you develop here, that it can, it can be a process just finding an institutional job or a position in private practice. If you're coming from a country that has a different pathway, like sometimes it can be really difficult to get a job as a conservator. I'm thinking of, we had an individual come work with us a few years ago who trained and had a graduate degree from Israel. And she was having a real hard time finding jobs as a conservator, but we were able to hire her for some contract work doing conservation documentation and kind of very isolated certain tasks. So sometimes you just have to be, think about that. And I encourage you to really network and reach out to people, because a lot of it is people are just ignorant about other training paths. And so if you get to know them personally, you can like kind of tell them about your background, they'll be, I think for the most part, more open, but a lot of it is just kind of ignorance in other training paths.
Great. Thank you. And with just about a minute left, I do want to ensure that we get the feedback from you all about this program as we continually work to improve our program. So my colleague Sophia will put into the chat a link to a really short evaluation that we'd be really grateful to have your thoughts on before we wrap up for today. I know that we've got a few more questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to respond to. But I'm happy to put into the chat as well an email address that I would encourage you to use, and we will try to get responses to you for those questions. I'm going to go ahead and put it in there now. And I want to thank all of our participants and thank you all for attending, for sharing your perspectives and some really terrific advice, stories, points of view on the work in conservation and collections management. So thank you all so much for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing more from you all. So I'm going to actually see if, oh, there we go. There's the survey. Thank you, Sophia, for putting that in there. So encourage everyone to click on that link and share with us your thoughts about this program. And thank you all so much for being here.